No, that's not the right scripture. It's 11:12 through 25.
So today's scripture is from Mark 11:12 to 25. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season of figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "It is not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and were seeking a way to destroy him. For they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." And Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly, I say to you, whoever say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt in the heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also, who is in heaven, may forgive you your trespasses." May God bless the reading of his word. Please be seated.
All right, and at this time, Point Gen Youth can be dismissed. Thank you, Nancy, for reading God's word for us. If I can give just a little nudge to us, we have a couple Bibles usually laying around. I think somebody took a couple. That's great. I challenge you guys and encourage you guys really to read along with us, even if Nancy's voice or whoever's voice is leading us. A way for us to step back from passivity and into a little bit more ownership is for us to just follow along and let our eyes be guided by the same text that she's reading. So an encouragement for you guys. Little things make a big difference. Well, happy Memorial Day. I don't know if people say happy Memorial Day, but it is Memorial Day, and it is, a lot of people have a lot of views on how we should treat days like Memorial Day. And for me, I guess this is one area where I'm still kind of a traditionalist, where I think it is important to recognize those who have paid a price, who had served in that way to be able to give their lives for the sake of the freedoms that we enjoy and sometimes take for granted. And so Memorial Day is one of those days. Veterans Day is another one of the days. We should thank and recognize lots and lots of servants in our culture, teachers, blue-collar, white-collar workers, but not without forgetting days like this as well. Memorial Day, known as Decoration Day, at some point in its history where Union soldiers and the price that they paid were remembered, and in remembrance there were sermons and songs and prayers and picnics to commemorate that sacrifice that they offered up on behalf of their nation. So don't let this weekend come and go without just a moment of reflection for what we enjoy at the expense of someone else. Now, to take that further up, I want to actually start with a little bit of a statement about my future here at PCC. And I want to do that, hope I didn't trigger anyone with that. I want to do that by a statement about my past here at PCC. In other words, how I started here. And one of the questions that were asked of me, and one of my responses to that question, and I said this to the I think it was Tony and Ming at that time, but I probably have said it to the rest of the transition team that brought me in and to some of you guys that have been at this church. I said, if you're looking for just a new guy to do the old thing, I'm probably not your guy. If you're looking for a new guy to do the old thing, maybe at a different level, maybe a little bit more systems and organization and whatever around it, I'm still not your guy. If you're looking for a new guy who's willing to do a new thing and be able to show how it is honestly more in connection with the old thing, meaning the old thing that Jesus and the apostles were doing, I might be your guy. And this, a passage like today, really brings that front and center, because this is one of those flashpoint passages that this series has really been working up to show if we're going to look at Jesus in a way that is different than how we've been accustomed to looking at Jesus. There's a QR code on the screen, which is meant for us to be a supplement to that Q&A session we'll have in about a half an hour. It's not meant to replace the in-person questioning, but if you need an alternate pathway, if you're not extroverted, if you're a little bit more of an internal processor and need to type out your question, feel free to fill out that Google form. It's a one-question form. You'll just type in your question. Somebody will get it back there, and we'll address it during the Q&A as well. All right? But we've been working towards... Marv, am I not on? I want to make sure that I have control of it up here. There we go. Yeah, so this series, The 13th Jesus, has really been about can we reimagine how we are looking at Jesus and the way that Jesus commends to us. And so it's really been about gaining and renewing our worldview, our lens through which we view our faith, at which we view, we're killing it today, at which we view our faith, the church, even Jesus himself. And so that's what really this series has been about. And so for a while, we've been introducing this diagram to get us to renew and reimagine Jesus, that he is not just a preacher, teacher, healer, miracle worker. He is also a strategic leader who is building a movement, manifesting a kingdom by dismantling unjust systems and structures that were prevailing in that day. And so as he's building his movement and he's calling his people, he's actually also taking this system down rung by rung. As he calls the fishermen, as he calls the tax collectors, as he engages with Herod. And today, we are getting closer to Jesus actually squaring off against his main target and destination in the Gospel of Mark, which is the institutions that Rome and the religious leaders of his day have conspired to create that are holding people back from God and one another. And so that's where we are. And recently, we have encountered a bit of, a deficiency in some of his followers. And as Jesus has been giving them new lenses to be able to view the mission of God, he's encountered the fact that they have, instead of new lenses, they've developed a sense of blindness, partial blindness along the way. And so Jesus has, along the way, every time he tells them a story that reveals their blindness, he has to also repeat for them, hey, this is going to lead to my ultimate demise in some sense, to my crucifixion. And they're like, what? They don't get it. So he has to remind them again. They're like, what? They don't get it. So he reminds them again because he's dealing with them at this level of partial blindness. They have become so accustomed to their way of life that they cannot handle anything new. And so last week, we dealt with this famous passage, a challenging passage, the passage of the rich young man. And what we said was, the way the partial blindness of that rich young man kind of manifested itself was he had become accustomed to this way of life and just wanted Jesus in some sense to do what this bartender's doing here on the left, which is to kind of just top it off. Like, hey, what I have in my cup is good. It's great. I've kept all the laws since my youth. And so I just need you, Jesus, to be my bartender who just tops off my drink. You don't need to question what I have in the cup. It's good. I just need you to give me that little last bit so that I can be good. So that I can, in his language, inherit eternal life. And what Jesus said is, no. He gave him a challenge, and that challenge was, you don't get to just assume that your contents are okay and have me just top it off so you kind of level up. What I'm going to ask you to do is instead empty your cup so that I can fill it afresh. I'm actually going to call into question the contents of your cup. And so you may not say to me, tip me off. You may say to me, fill my cup, as long as you're willing to first have it be emptied. And so that's where Jesus left us off last week. And this week, he is going to once again give us an invitation that's also a challenge, where he's going to tell us, going to encourage us to pursue the ideals more than we police reactions. He's going to tell us to pursue the ideal state of affairs between God and people, pursue those ideals rather than police people's reactions to when those ideals are ignored or violated. Pursue the ideals rather than police the reactions. Let's see what that means. Let's go to the Lord and then open up Mark chapter 11 together. Father, would you help us to receive the challenge you have for us? Help us to be encouraged. Help us to be optimistic. Help us to gain a vision of where this could go rather than look at all of the reasons why this is too difficult or we don't agree. Help us to be open. Give us your Spirit to that end in a way that glorifies you, that helps us, that serves us, that brings us joy, and ultimately makes us more useful, thoughtful people for those to whom you've sent us. In Jesus' name, amen, amen, and amen. Well, I said that the Gospel of Mark and Jesus is calling us to pursue the ideals rather than police the reactions. So let's see what it means for us to police the reactions. Let's see what it means for us to see what the reactions are. And we're going to start in chapters 11, verses 12 through 14. And we're going to start with an unusual Jesus, one that kind of comes off a little bit petty. So if you're looking at your text, I want you to go to chapter 11, verse 12, and it talks about Jesus being very, very human. We see the humanity of Jesus here. When it says he was hungry, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Long day's journey, he's been preaching, he's been teaching, he's had a full day, and he's hungry. Okay, makes sense. Verse 13, he was looking for something to eat. He went to a tree, and it says there's nothing but leaves on the tree. Okay, bummer. Jesus is hungry, he's looking to pull something off a tree, low-hanging fruit, and there's nothing there. I could see how that would be frustrating. But then it says at the end of verse 13, for it was not the season for figs. Right? So you can't blame the tree in some sense. Right? If there was a category of blaming trees, this wouldn't fit. Because it's not the season where they should be getting fruit. And so Jesus, I get you're hungry, I get that you went looking for fruit, but it's not time for the fruit. Okay, so Jesus goes and maybe he'll find some hummus somewhere else. Who knows? But then it says in verse 14, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And the disciples heard it. So Jesus is hungry, doesn't get what he wants because it's not the time to give him what he wants. And his response is, curse this tree. Right? This is more than hangry. This is more than a hangry Jesus. But maybe it's not less than that. Right? What is happening here in this passage? What exactly is happening that Jesus would get so ticked off that he would personify a tree and says, I curse you, as if it's the tree's fault? If we don't read this passage within its context, you could end there. And you could come to that conclusion. But we've been talking about this kind of literary structure throughout the Gospel of Mark, a sandwich, in which you have to be able to understand how the different pieces work in order to understand what's happening. And so the sandwich in today's passage looks a little something like this. There's a curse given in these first three verses about a fig tree, and then we'll turn away from the fig tree, or will we? And then we'll come back to the fig tree again. So there's this thing about a tree, there's this thing about a temple, and then there's this thing about a tree again. And so the idea is you're going to understand what's happening with the tree based on what Jesus does with the temple. And so let's see what Jesus is going to do with the temple. And as we get into the meat or the tempeh, if you're my wife, if you're in that section, I want us to kind of engage with this text. What do you hear when you hear about what I'm about to read? What do you see? And maybe even more than that, what might you object to as we read this? In verses 15 and 16 specifically. He entered the temple, and it says he began to drive out those who sold, those who bought. He overturned the tables, and he overturned the seats. And this is my favorite in some sense because it's the most provocative. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything throughout the temple. Right? When you see this, when you hear this, what do you see and hear? Right? Because you guys have heard of this passage before. It's the temple cleansing. And I hope when you hear temple cleansing and cleaning, you don't imagine Jesus getting on like his, hands and knees and putting yellow rubber gloves on and getting ready to like kind of scrub the temple, do a little spring cleaning. That's not what's happening here. That's not what's happening here. I don't think this is what's happening either. There's some people doing stuff over there, and there's some tables and seats that aren't being used, and so Jesus is kind of just doing one of those. I don't think that's what's happening either. And in fact, if you were to read some of the other gospel versions of this temple cleansing, you would read that he is actually going to the places where people are, and that's what he's overturning. So he's overturning seats where people are sitting on. He's overturning tables that people are posted up at. And that last one, he would not allow anyone to carry anything throughout the temple. I don't think he was asking nicely. Would you mind dropping what you are carrying throughout this temple? I think people are carrying things throughout the temple, and Jesus is probably like, or oh, what do you got there? And I actually don't mean to do this to be irreverent. I mean this to be reverent. Because I don't want to sanitize and suburbanize what Jesus is doing here. Because we are so prone to do that. There is something in here. A couple of weeks ago, I referred to this backfire effect. This phenomenon that happens in our brains when, something is endangering our lives. Someone breaks into our house, God forbid. Right? And your brain, the part of your brain lights up where you feel like your life is in danger or the lives of those you care about is in danger. Rightfully so. Well, the backfire effect is that same phenomenon happens whenever you have a precious view of yours challenged. The same part of your brain lights up, and you feel as though my life is at risk when this view is at risk. Because it makes sense for you to say, hey, my life is at risk when this guy broke into my house with a weapon. That makes sense. And what I'm saying is it also makes sense to certain people when certain views are being challenged, that the same parts of their brain lights up and that they would receive it as, my life is in danger. My way of life is in danger. And I think we all have a backfire effect in some sense to what's happening with Jesus here, because we're repelled in some sense by this. And you might be repelled in some sense even by what's happening on college campuses with this conflict right now. And maybe not with the conflict, but maybe how people are responding to the conflict. Maybe that repels you. Because it violates in some sense what we think of as the right way to object. Right? Some of us have a hard time at all with protest. And then it's like, okay, we have a category for protest. We have a category, and we call them, and we give them names, civil disobedience or peaceful protest. Because we're thinking about, well, hey, listen, like, consider the fallout, what happens, right? Consider the fallout of what happens when, you're protesting and all of a sudden you start throwing things through university windows. And now we've diverted our attention from the the focus of the conflict, and now we're diverting our focus to how people are responding to that conflict. So I get that. And I get that we say, hey, if we protest, we should do so in an orderly manner so as to limit the fallout of it. But I want us to hold that in one hand, and I want us to hold this passage in the other hand. Because this passage should push us against this. But not just this passage. If we think of who we are as a people, as a tradition, we are, and we don't go around saying this stuff, like no one's here and being like, I am a Protestant. No one says that in here. If you do, you're a different kind of person. But in some sense, we stand in the tradition that follows out of the Protestant Reformation, right? Some of us were trained in schools that really upheld a Reformed theology. I was one of them. And one of the things that you have to know about the Reformation, which is a good thing, I'm happy it happened. It was an abolitionist movement that needed to happen. However, there was a fallout from it. There were implications and outcomes that came from it, namely the Peasants' War, where peasants who realized that they didn't have to be held down by the nobility of their day, all of a sudden started to have a reaction to it. And they killed thousands of noblemen. And then because they had less resources, and they had less weaponry, and they had less money, hundreds and thousands of peasants were killed during the Peasants' War. And it was an unfortunate but also a very understandable consequence from the Reformation. And the Reformation was a necessary movement that happened given the state of affairs that existed in medieval Europe. So in one sense, we have a category for a response that has negative fallout. And maybe your objection isn't, okay, fine, we understand that whenever there's some sort of reform, there's going to be fallout. Maybe your response is the methods. I don't like the methods. I don't like the methods being used. I understand that too. But again, this is where we need to appeal a little bit to our history and where we say, where do we object to the forms of resistance and where do we not? Right? Because if I said this, like if we were, I said this to students at Princeton once, I want you to imagine in some sense a community of young men who are going around looting houses, burning down buildings, and smearing excrement on the walls of those who do not agree with their political perspective at the time. And if that didn't work, that they would actually go and engage in far more like physically harmful forms of coercion. The word would be tarring and feathering somebody. And if you just heard what I just said, all of us would be like repelled by those kinds of methods, rightfully so. And yet what you would be doing in some sense is you would be chronicling some of the methods that were used by those who were known as the Sons of Liberty. And we think, oh, Sons of Liberty, Boston Tea Party, they spilled a little tea in a harbor. But these were the methods, the non-civil or the uncivil methods that they used in order to move their agenda forward. And yet none of us are out here, and none of us have throughout our history criticized the Sons of Liberty because they said, well, yeah, but they were fighting for something just, and so, the methods and the means were the ways that they got to those just ends. Maybe you're not, okay, fine, we get that there's implications that happen. We get that sometimes there's the need for methods that are a little bit controversial. Maybe you're far more like, nowadays we've moved past that era, and so now we just need to work through the laws. Work through the laws, work through the existing systems, work through the courts and legislation in order for there to be change. Okay. That was, by the way, some of you guys are familiar with the letter from a Birmingham jail, right? Have you guys, how many of you guys have ever read it? Have you guys ever read the letter? Okay, great. If nothing else, even if you, in some sense, have an objection to what was happening at that time, Dr. King's response, it's just great writing and great reading. So I would encourage you to read it. Does anyone know what prompted the letter from a Birmingham jail? Does anyone know the piece of writing that actually prompted it? It's actually called A Call for Unity. And it was written by 9 ministers, 8 Christian ministers, 1 rabbi, who largely would have been considered the progressives of their day, the moderates of their day. And what they said to Dr. King was basically, hey, first of all, you and your outsider friends, let's just go back to where you came from. Let us handle this locally. Because if we handle this locally, we'll handle it through the accepted means, the laws, the court systems. And, Dr. King's response in that letter was, I could tell you're ticked at me. I could tell you're irritated by my methods and the methods of those who are working with me. I wish you were as ticked off by the circumstances that brought about this protest. I wish you were ticked off by the fact that this was ignored and this was violated for a long, long time under your watch. I wish you were as irritated by that as you are by my reaction. So I wish you weren't in such a rush to police my reaction, and you should have instead policed your negligence. Because when you say things like, why don't you just go through the laws and go through the systems, you're ignoring some historical realities. Because those same things were said in the past. The people that didn't go through the laws during these past episodes were also called criminals. But you got to remember, the laws allowed for there to be such things as chattel slavery and the Holocaust and Jim Crow segregation. And so when you're asking people to work within the same systems that created the systemic injustice, you're asking them to just kind of accept this state of affairs far, far longer. I want us to be open to the fact that our biblical worldview should have a category for civil disobedience and peaceful protest. However, what I also hope this passage should help you do is understand there is also a category for uncivil obedience. And that Jesus here is showing at least one depiction of uncivil obedience. And it's not just Jesus showing it. Because what this passage is supposed to get you to understand, especially with the language of he drove out in verse 15, is it's trying to get you to understand the storyline that is happening from the Torah through the book of Joshua and the Judges. And it's this military term back in the ancient world called herem warfare. And what herem warfare was God calling his people to go into the land in which there was a unjust system of affairs set up, in which people were violating other people and people were violating God, and he called his people to go in and lay that land to waste. And in some sense, we should have a problem when we read those books of, I hope you do, when you read Joshua and Judges and you see what the children of Israel are doing in those lands, I hope you feel some conflict over it. Whether or not you realize that God had called them to that herem warfare, to basically possess that land in God's name. I hope when you read that, you don't read that as like, simple, non-problematic. No. There should be this conflict in you. There should be this conflict in you when you're reading Jesus cleansing the temple too. And it's not about this situation where we're like, oh, this is what we should do at all times. And this is what we should say yes to in culture when people engage in uncivil action. But what it is getting us to do in some sense is to slow our roll and to not rush to police the reactions without doing something first. Let me pause and say what that thing is. Have you ever been in your families? Have you ever gotten into a conflict, whether you're with your wife or your husband, your wife or your husband, your kids, and you ever say, if the conflict happens, then you get into this point when you're like, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. Does that happen in your home? Right? I think that's a valid thing to say to people. So you guys are smiling, you're nodding, so this happens. Okay. And I think that that's valid to be able to say, no. How you say matters. How you react does matter. I want us to, I'm not going to ask you this, but I want us to reflect in that moment a little bit. And I want you to think, when you say that, do you intend to get back to what you said? Or do we use the how you said as kind of our escape hatch to get out of that conversation and not deal with the what you said? And I think if we're honest, sometimes we pull out the, hey, your tone, I have a problem with your tone, as a way of deflecting and distracting from the issue that's actually at hand. And so we police the tone, we police the reaction, so we don't actually have to deal with the state of affairs that's resulted. It's fine for you to say, it's not what you said, it's how you said it, if you eventually will get back to what was said. But if you are saying it's not what you said, it's how you said it, and you never get back to the what, that's you policing the reaction in a way that's absolving yourself of responsibility for that state of affairs that prompted the reaction in the first place. And I think that happens in our families. I think that happens in our communities. I think that happens in our societies. And I think it's going to happen in this passage. And instead, what Jesus wants us to do is, Jesus is not endorsing, I don't think he's endorsing violent opposition here. What I think the point of this passage too is whether or not you will pursue the ideals, not just police the reactions. So what are the ideals? We see that in verse 17, where Jesus says, and he was teaching them and saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. He's just mentioned the ideal. When he says, is it not written? It's a rhetorical question. It was written. He knows that. He's saying, hey, don't you know the standard? Don't you know the ideal? And the ideal here was this place that you have turned into an economy was supposed to be a place where people could meet God and one another. That's the ideal. Pursue that ideal. And as we're going to see here, the people in opposition to Jesus and the people that Jesus is in opposition to, they don't ever answer that question. They just get back into policing his reaction and responding to it. But I want us to pause a little bit, because what does it mean for this to be a house of prayer for all peoples? What does it mean for Jesus to say that this is for everyone? And I want us to think about, would they have disagreed with him? Right? Because he's quoting Isaiah 56. He's quoting what it would look like when Israel is restored and have come back from exile. And Jesus is talking to a people who are now in Israel. They're not in Babylon anymore. They're not in Assyria. They're not in they are in the land. And so they see themselves as a people back from exile. They see themselves as part of the restoration of Israel. And so when Jesus says, hey, Isaiah 56, restoration of Israel, isn't supposed to be a prayer, a house of prayer for all peoples? They're like, yeah, for sure. We agree. And it is that. Jesus, look around. We got people from different ethnic groups here. We have people from different ages here. We have people from different classes here, Jesus. This is an inclusive place for people to meet one another and God. And yet, Jesus vehemently disagrees. He vehemently disagrees that even though, like if they were to be a brochure, they would look like, that typical college brochure when you have like 4 different people from 4 different ethnicities and one of them's randomly pointing at a laptop and the other one's looking at someone else just laughing and all that. Like they would have looked like that brochure. And yet Jesus is indicting them for violating the vision of Isaiah 56, that this is not a house of prayer for all peoples. It has become a den of robbers. It has become a place where people buy and sell. It has become a place where tables and seats are set up. It has become a place where there are intentional systems and structures that are meant to, yes, have all the people, but still maintain the caste. So this has violated the ideal. And the question is, in what sense do we intentionally build, dismantle, or unintentionally allow the same realities to emerge in our midst? Because I think we would say, yep, PCC is a place for all people. And then you'd have to ask yourself, is it? And I know in some sense you're like, oh, this is pro Tim, so he must mean race right now. I could, but I could also mean age, right? Churches like ours, in some sense, tend to, without saying it, they tend to like promote younger, people, maybe younger families, and they forget about anyone over the age of 50. No, we'll keep you around because you'll tithe, you'll give us money. And so we need that, but as far as like programming, we'll never really ask you. As far as skills, we'll never really ask you. As far as leading, we'll not really ever ask you, maybe. And so we have these ways in which we'll say, no, this is for all ages, and yet it might not be. This is for all classes, and yet it might not be. This is for all, and you can add the list to that. This is for all political perspectives, and yet it might not be. And so what Jesus is calling us to do is pursue, to build, and where we need to, tear down systems, structures, policies, norms to actually become a house of prayer and community and worship and teaching for all peoples, intentionally so. And so how are we doing that? And how are we not doing that? Well, let me list a couple. Maybe you can think of others, and you might think of ways in which we're kind of ignoring this as well. So let me just mention a couple. So tomorrow, right, Venita is trying to mobilize several of us who are generally local or local to the town or the region to just be present during the Memorial Day parade that happens in town here in Franklin, right? And you might think, oh, that's not a lot. That's not anything really. But if you really, really think about it, churches are, they welcome everybody, but here's the catch, is you kind of have to do it on the church's terms oftentimes. Like, you got to come to our stuff. And so we invite you to our VBS, and we invite you to our egg hunt, and we invite you to our Sunday morning service, but we don't really want to go to the things that you have going on. And so this is one way in which we are pushing ourselves towards this ideal. The day after, on Tuesday, we're having a board meeting to consider what does it mean for us to flesh out our criteria for board members, and to flesh out our criteria for whether we'll have something called covenant partners or members. Wanting to be as intentional as we can be to get towards the ideal. In a couple of weeks, my CG will look at our job descriptions and our bylaws to see if what we've been studying together as a CG over the last 6 months in terms of what it means for us to be an equity-aligned community, does that show up in the ways that we set up job descriptions and even orient and organize our church. Venita setting up her point care training on June 9th on a Sunday, giving us kind of foundational skills to be able to care for all people and not let anyone slip through the cracks. And by saying care for all people, intentionally care for the various needs that different people groups, ages, stages of life have. You can go on, keep going on with this. I have a meeting with a rabbi and imam set up this week to be able to see how is it that we as a church could contribute to peacemaking between these two communities that have been in conflict with each other, and not just for the last 6, 7, 8 months, but for centuries. What does it mean for us to be peacemakers and intentionally pursue the ideal? And then even our families. Think of our marriages, our parenting. Here's what I want us to really understand. What happens if we do nothing? And your answer to that might be nothing. And I'm here to say, and I think Jesus is here to say, that if you do nothing, something bad happens. That the worst things in some sense that we see around us in the world, in surrounding communities, in our communities, in this church, in our homes, and in our individual lives. The worst things that come about because we do nothing. We just allow stuff to happen. You can't stay neutral on a moving train, and life is a moving train. And so if you stand in one place, you will be carried along with that momentum. And years will go by, and you will have a state of affairs that you will want to push back on, but you won't know how. And the only way to do it will be to do something drastic, like overturn some tables and disallow people from carrying stuff. And some level of uncivil obedience will have to arise. And what happens when we pursue those ideals rather than police people's reactions to it? Well, in verse 18, you'll see what happens. In verse 18, the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him. Their backfire effect kicked in. And even though Jesus, in some sense, was making a case, a biblical case, from their own prophets, in their minds, all they could see was their way of life, their status quo being threatened. Jesus, you're not doing this through the appropriate means. You're not doing this with the appropriate methods. Do you know what the fallout is going to be from this, Jesus? And so they had given themselves every justification to why Jesus was not in the right. And so what did they have to do? To preserve their way of life, they had to find a way to destroy him. And to get back to that last part of the passage, here's Jesus' response. Now the disciples, once they leave the city and they see the cleansing, they realize what Jesus meant all along when he did that petty cursing of the tree. It wasn't a petty cursing of the tree at all. That tree was an echo back to a passage in Jeremiah 8, where the prophet Jeremiah says to Israel, you cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. You act like everything's okay. You act like the state of affairs that was here was fine, and that my intervention, uncivil though it may be, you act like that's the problem. So you're more focused on policing my tone and policing my reaction than you are about the state of affairs that warranted this reaction. And then that passage actually says, I came looking for figs on the tree, and what I gave them had passed away. And now, instead, it was to be a time of terror for God's people. That's what Jesus does in word. That's what he says in word. This cleansing of the temple is how he expresses that in deed. Both word and deed were necessary given where this temple, where the state of affairs had gotten to. The question is, what are we willing to say and do in order to pursue the ideals rather than us policing the reactions to whatever people's responses are to those ideals being violated? Let me pause here and give us some time to respond, because I know what I've said here is heavy. This isn't one of those feel-good messages, like, yay. I know that there's probably going to be some reactions. There's probably going to be some pushback. So have at it. Raise your hand. The mic will come at you. And there's no need to be polite with this. You guys could be as real as you want to be, so go ahead. Within reason, obviously. Don't throw stuff. But
I don't speak that often. This kind of hits home. Slavery, Holocaust, segregation. Absolutely evil, every one of them. Deserve to be totally abolished. 100% on board. Then you jump over to talk about the Sons of Liberty. Pointed out the first small thing that they did, which was evil, pure evil. Not the majority, small group. Never should have endorsed those guys, which should happen. Then you jump to the campuses. What we have is a bunch of spoiled, ignorant kids being led by these radical groups to do things. It's one thing to protest and speak out. I agree with that. Second, the First Amendment, correct, freedom of speech, peaceful assembly. When you start right? Why do these protesters do what they do? Because nothing happens to them. They can break property, they can do what they gotta do, they can assault police. Nothing happens, especially in New York City. It's a joke, it's a zoo. If people had to answer for what they did and be held accountable, and what I mean by that is simply removing their face masks, let the public see who they are. Half these kids, I don't understand half, they make a mistake. I guarantee 90% of these kids have no idea what they're protesting. It's just a chance to cause trouble. To ask them about the history of the leagues, they probably have no idea. There's paid people in there egging these kids on. So the point with Jesus, I believe, was Jesus was doing what he did was a right thing. It was exactly what had to be done at that time. But you didn't see him assaulting people, in a sense, beating people up. You didn't see him looting and burning. These kids have taken it too far. And in my opinion, it's over the top. I'm glad you gave this message. I think it's great, but I think that's the other side that needs to be said. If there's no punishment, and I'm saying it softly, for doing what you're doing, why not do it? What stops me from punching a cop in the face? It's because I know hopefully he'll issue me a nice beating, and I'll do jail time. That doesn't happen anymore. We lost our moral compass. We lost. These things can't be allowed to be done. Protest, absolutely, but not violent. That's it.
Yeah, no, thanks for that perspective. So a couple things. One, we could stand we could stand 200 years removed from this, about 100 years removed from this, and about 60, 70 years removed from this, and we could say totally, absolutely wrong. People were not saying that at that time. People were saying this very same thing, like, hey, all right, fine, there's a problem with slavery, there's a problem with Jim Crow segregation, just go through the laws. Now, the problem is, have we looked at, and you said some really...
If you don't mind, I think
Can I just finish?
you're glossing over.
Can I finish, though?
500,000 people died over slavery. Because the union stepped in, and that's what took care of their slavery. Anybody
Who stepped in? Sorry.
the union,
Okay.
the war, we forget we had a war over slavery, correct?
Sure.
Right. Am I right? I mean, anybody who argues that the South was seceding because they had their own interest was slavery.
Sure.
Legal letters of secession, all stated we need our slaves.
Yep.
That's absolutely wrong.
Yep.
People died to stop slavery.
Yeah.
A Holocaust.
Yep.
For people being killed. We fought a war over that.
Yep.
Without the United States, who knows what would happen? We stepped in there. Segregation, absolutely disgraceful because of someone's color. I think we've come a long way.
Yeah, so that's what I thought you were going to say. We've come...
Still racism? I agree with you on that. But I don't think the answer to any of those, and I'm just going to say it as it applies, is robbing, looting, and burning. Because then what I see from my point of view is you've now lost your voice. And you've turned it out of control. I don't even want to hear what you have to say. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Let me just finish what I was going to say. I think there's a couple things I would say that. There's a lot of what you said that I would agree with, because I started off by saying we should all, in some sense, be repulsed by some of the reactions that we're seeing. And yet, if we turn our eyes to the reactions instead of the state of affairs that brought about the reactions, we're ending up where the Pharisees and Sadducees ended up, which is they could have just been like, yo, Jesus, what? And if you read the other gospel accounts, Mark is actually a pretty tame one. If you read the other gospel accounts, Jesus is actually breaking out whips. And I don't think he's just breaking out whips because if you're using the language of drove out, it's meant to call you to the warfare of Exodus and Joshua and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Judges, which is not just like complaining angrily in a corner civilly. It's meant to call you to the biblical teaching on warfare and conquest, which Jesus is pulling on here. Because this is during the time of Passover. And what are you supposed to do during the time of Passover? Take the leaven out of the house. Which is why in the Gospels, when it talks about the cleansing of the temple, Jesus says, take these things from where? My Father's house. And what does he say a couple chapters before this in the Gospel of Mark? They do not understand the what? The leaven of the Pharisees. They don't understand that they're the unclean things that needed to be removed out during Passover time. And so what Jesus is doing here is not just like getting angry. And I'll use the language of cleanse the temple because that's what's been used. Jesus is looting the temple. And if we want to be biblical people, let's be biblical people. He's looting the temple. Now, he's not prescribing that we should do that same thing. But what I hope this does is it should confuse our categories a little bit, because we can't just say Jesus has never done this. Or if we do say that, if we say that our category is you never ever loot, which I hope we should say. I would teach my kids, hey, don't go looting, find other ways of protesting. But if we say to loot equals sin, then I guess Jesus is sinning here because he's looting unless you're just finding some other way to biblicize this passage. That's the first thing. The second thing is there are different ways that the same kind of caste-making motive shows out. And I think this shows out in race, shows up in age, shows up in disability, shows up in all sorts of ways. The same thing that happens with chattel slavery, guess what? We passed laws. Like Marty said, we fought a fight, we fought a war, and we passed laws to abolish chattel slavery. So why do we need Juneteenth 3 years after the fact to go throughout the Union when slavery had actually picked up after the Emancipation Proclamation? Why do we need that? Because there is this desire that maintains, and it's in us to make caste. Why is there Jim Crow segregation 70 years after the fact of this? Because there's something in us that morphs and finds new ways to be able to carry out the old thing. And what I'm saying is those ways still exist. And when they exist, our focus should go to how do we bring about the ideal more than it is policing the lack of ideal that's brought about by the protesters. Because that's why Jesus is saying, this house was meant to be something that it is currently not. And that's where he wants the focus of this passage to be. And what the Sadducees and Pharisees are doing instead is like, we don't like the way he's doing this. We got to find a way to destroy him. So I hear what you're saying, Martin. There's a lot of what you're saying that I agree with, and then there's a lot that's getting left behind if you think about this biblically. I don't even want to think about this politically. We could do that, and I would disagree with saying that the Sons of Liberty did this little thing. If you looked at their method, if you looked at their MO, I'm not saying it was everything, but it was more than just a thing. It was not just like they had a bad day, and so they decided to tar and feather a couple people. They were doing this to heads of state. They were doing this to Hutchinson. They were doing this to multiple people. Rush, Revere, Benedict Arnold, John Hancock. So these aren't just a few fringe people. So historically, I have a little bit of a push on what you're saying. And then biblically, we are ignoring whole storylines if we are saying what Jesus is doing here is just getting a little bit angry. He's absolutely looting the central institution that he came to abolish. He is absolutely trying to dismantle the central institution that he came to abolish. Because that's where'd it go? That's what this is. This thing that Augustus, Tiberius, and Caligula are joining in with Herod Antipas in doing is the temple. It's the thing that Jesus has been working towards all the way. It's the thing that he has been orienting for. Why is he saying, I'm going to be delivered up to the chief priests and the Pharisees and I will be killed? He's not just predicting his crucifixion. He's also predicting his critique of this and the knowledge of where it will get him. And so if we want to come up with a gospel that's saying, hey, Jesus came to be crucified, like that's part of our lens, we also need to have a gospel that says Jesus also came to condemn and in not so polite a way. So I agree with a lot of what you said, Mart, and I think I would want to say more than what you said. I'd want to say at least what you said, but I'd want to say more, and I think, with all due respect, maybe in a conversation, I didn't hear the more from you. So that's just where I would pause that. Go ahead.
I think that when I'm hearing this and when I'm looking at it, I think there's two things that is hard and good for me. It's like, it's hard to see Jesus like this for me. I think that there's always a part of me that looks at Jesus and just wants to see him as the loving, caring, healing person. And at the same time, I'm happy about this Jesus because I see a Jesus who loves to the point of disruption. And I want a Jesus like that. I think that sometimes what we miss in this is that that same disruption that led him to this was the same thing that led him to the cross. His love for us is not just one that is going to be gracious, but it's also the one that disciplines. It's the one that causes us to see our sin and not like it, and wants us, calls his sin to say that if it causes us to sin, to cut it off. This is that same Jesus. It's the same Jesus that healed. And I think we have to have that lens when we're realizing this. This is not, even though it's disruptive and even though it messes with us, this is the same Jesus that went to the cross for us. And I think we have to hold those things with a great tension, because I think, for me, as you can tell, I'm a black man.
Wait, what?
Yeah. And the realities that sometimes I live in feels different from a lot of the people that I know, have seen in church, and have walked with. And I think that sometimes I find myself not knowing where to stand or what to do, but I'm thankful that I have a Jesus who I can go to, and he understands both sides. I'm thankful for a Jesus that can love me enough to call me out on the things that I do wrong, but also stands up for me when I don't know what it's going to look like for justice to reign free.
I think what both of you guys are saying, and I hate when people say they're saying the same thing, and they're not. But I will say that it's synthesizable because I like the way you said it, is this Jesus? And what Marty is rightly saying is so many people that want I think, Marty, if I'm saying this wrong, correct me. So many people that want the privilege to loot don't have this in mind anywhere. They're just a bunch of kids who just want to break stuff. And I'm not even going to disagree with him on that. I can't say 90%, and that's the number you said. I do know, however, that I have been involved in student protest movements that were involved and led and organized by well-meaning students that had a cross-shaped life. And I've been in student protest movements where I go up to the student and be like, hey, do you know what we're actually protesting? And it's like, no, I don't give a rip at all. I just want a day off of school. Right? And so that's where what Marty's saying does have some merit to it. The call for us is we don't need to accept the worldly version of whether it's civil disobedience or uncivil disobedience. I think what Jesus extends to us is a category, a lens, a worldview in which we can hold both together because he holds both together. And I think that the 13th Jesus, if I can expand a little bit on it, is that gospel is not just a gospel of atonement, it is also a gospel of abolitionist activism. And we've accepted one far more than the other. And I don't think a passage and a Gospel of Mark like this allows us to just say, we're just going to take that one. But to Marty's point, I don't think the Gospel of Mark allows us to endorse old, young, black, brown, white in society that just says, we're just going to take that one. I think what it's calling us to is to hold the both together in a way that maybe we have not really seen in our day and age and community. And so therein lies our opportunity. But in order for us to do that, we first have to approach God on God's terms, so that whatever we have in us that would take this one way or the other, either take us to atonement where we would kind of ignore all the state of affairs that were violated, that hold other people back from God and one another. If we come up with an atonement that ignores this, we need to confess and repent of that. If we come up with a form of abolition or activism that doesn't have atonement in mind, we need to confess and repent of that. The point is, we need a two-lensed Jesus, a two-lensed gospel, and a two-lensed way of discipleship if we are going to move forward. So by all means, thank you, Mart. Thank you, Jelani. Thank you, all those who have questions and haven't asked them. I will be here to continue to follow up and follow through on this. At this time, though, I want to make a way for us to come to the table and come to a Jesus that you might be somewhat uncomfortable with, who, at least on one occasion, did something that violates, that causes a backfire effect in us because it doesn't meet our categories, it doesn't meet our civility. But as Jelani said, it's that lack of civility that also brought him to the cross. And so if you say Jesus came to die on a cross, you must also say that he came to cleanse the temple. And so that's the Jesus I invite you to come to at this table. So let me pray and then come when you are ready. Father,